On a dock in Shenzhen, a finished steel shipping container rolls off an assembly line once every few minutes. And almost every single one of those boxes on Earth comes from one country. Not most of them, 95% of them. Here is the number that should stop you. Only a handful of Chinese companies build roughly 95% of the world's standard dry containers, and nearly 100% of the refrigerated ones. Not a prototype, not a forecast. That is who packs your phone, your medicine, and your car parts today. And in 2020, the world found out what happens when that one supply chain hiccups. Prices didn't rise, they exploded. But the reason isn't cheap labor, and it isn't what you think. Hit like and subscribe so you don't miss how this happened. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly how America invented this box and then handed it away, why no other country can copy the system even when they try, and why one Chinese port going quiet for 4 weeks did more damage than a giant ship blocking the Suez Canal. To understand how a single country ended up holding the whole planet by a steel box, you have to go back to the day the box was born. And it wasn't born in China. April 26, 1956, a converted World War II oil tanker called the Ideal X pushed out of Port Newark, bound for Houston. On its deck sat 58 metal boxes. People on the dock didn't cheer. Most of them had no idea they were watching the old world end. The man behind it was Malcolm McLean, an American trucking owner. He wasn't an engineer. He was a guy who hated waiting. He'd watch dock workers spend days loading one ship by hand, one piece at a time. So he asked a simple question. What if you never unpacked the truck at all? What if you just lifted the whole box onto the ship? Here is the comparison that makes that idea hit properly. Loading loose cargo the old way cost around $5.80 per ton. Loading the Ideal X in boxes cost about 16 cents a ton. That is not a small improvement. That is the same job for a fraction of the price. And it erased the distance between continents almost overnight. So here is the paradox that runs through this whole story. The container was invented in America, patented in America, proven in America. And today, American companies build almost none of them. The country that created the box lost control of it almost immediately. Why? It started with a fight at home. As these boxes took over the ports, the men who used to load ships by hand saw exactly what was coming for their jobs. Dock workers in New York and London walked out. Strikes spread across the waterfront. Ship owners bled money every week their ships sat still. So to end the standoff, they raised wages sharply for the workers who stayed. And that sounds like a win. Here is the catch nobody warns you about. Higher wages on the docks meant higher costs everywhere the boxes were made. Steel mills raised prices. Factory workers wanted more per shift. Very quickly, building a container in America or Europe stopped making sense. The math flipped. It cost more to weld the box than you could ever earn renting it out. Picture a bakery where the flour and the labor cost more than anyone will pay for the bread. That was Western container manufacturing by the 1970s. A dead end. So the work moved to Asia, and one country was about to do something no one else would. Through the 1990s, container production drifted from South Korea to China, and Beijing didn't treat it as a low-value job to tolerate. It treated it as territory to own. State-backed companies moved in. The government backed them directly. And over the next 15 years, China didn't just take the largest share, it took almost all of it. Today, 3 companies do most of the work: The largest, CIMC, alone builds something like 40% of the world's containers. Line up the top few Chinese producers, and you're looking at over 80% of global output from 3 names. And most people stop the story right here. Cheap labor, big factories, government help, done. But that explanation is a trap, because it's only half the story. If this were just about cheap hands, then when wages in China rose, the work would have moved on to Vietnam or India, the way it always had before. It didn't. It stayed locked in China. So something else is holding it in place. 2 things, actually. And the first is hiding inside the metal itself, because here is a question almost nobody asks. The ocean destroys steel. Salt spray, constant water, waves the height of a 3-story building slamming the hull. Drop an ordinary piece of iron on a ship's deck, and in a couple of years, it's a pile of rust. So how does a plain steel box survive out there for decades and not rot away? Quick thing before the answer, because this next part is what actually explains the monopoly. Hit that subscribe button and the notification bell, both, so the moment we drop the next breakdown on China's industrial machine, it lands in front of you. Now, the steel. Containers aren't made from ordinary iron. They're made from a special alloy called Corten steel. And the story of Corten is the story of the whole industry in miniature, because it was also invented in America. Engineers at US Steel developed it back in the 1930s. The name is the pitch. COR for corrosion resistance. TEN for tensile strength. What they wanted was a steel that protects itself so you'd never have to paint it. And they found the recipe by adding tiny, precisely measured amounts of copper, chromium, nickel, and phosphorus into the metal. Here is why that matters, and the physics is genuinely elegant. Ordinary rust is porous. It's full of tiny holes, so water and oxygen keep seeping through to the fresh metal underneath, and the rot never stops. It eats all the way through. Corten does the opposite. When it's exposed to weather, the surface still rusts, but this rust forms a dense, sealed layer, a patina, that locks onto the steel and blocks air and water from ever reaching the core. In plain terms, the metal grows its own armor. And if you scratch it, in the right wet and dry conditions, the armor reforms. The damage seals itself. So you'd think any country could just grab the formula and start producing. This is exactly where Western steelmakers hit a wall. Making Corten at scale is punishing. It needs enormous energy and very powerful furnaces, and the chemistry is unforgiving. Push the phosphorus a fraction too far, and an entire giant batch of expensive alloy turns brittle and useless. Competitors looked at the cost and the risk of getting it wrong and simply refused to pour billions into something that finicky. China poured the billions. Over 2 decades, Chinese firms built a new generation of massive steel mills and locked up the supply of the raw ingredients. And the scale here is hard to overstate. China now makes more than half of all the steel on Earth, more than the rest of the world combined. A single container uses around 2 tons of Corten. When your raw material is made in your own backyard, at that scale, nobody can touch your price. The West didn't just lose the factories, it lost the ability to feed them. But even if you handed a Western factory that steel for free, it would still go bankrupt. And the reason is a rule of logistics so simple it sounds stupid. Imagine buying a full-price plane ticket and then flying that seat across the world completely empty. That sounds insane. But that is exactly the mistake a shipping company makes every time it's forced to move an empty container. An empty steel box weighs close to 4 tons. It takes a full slot on the deck of a ship. And here's the part that breaks the business. The ship burns the exact same expensive fuel to carry that empty box as it burns to carry one packed full of goods. Moving air across an ocean is a guaranteed loss. Nobody can afford it for long. That single rule is what trapped the rest of the world. For years, foreign companies assumed they could just build container factories at home and compete. Then they hit the simple truth. It's not enough to melt good steel and weld a box. The container has to be built exactly where it's going to be filled with real cargo, right away in that same spot. Chinese planners saw this coming back in the 1990s. They didn't build their factories somewhere cheap and inland. They built giant automated plants right up against the docks of the biggest export terminals, Shanghai, Shenzhen. And the whole thing runs like one machine. A new container comes off the line, gets its coating, and goes straight onto the terminal next door, where it's loaded with electronics, or clothes, or new machinery. From its very first second of life, that box is already earning, already paying back what it cost to build. Now look at the foreign competitor. A factory in Europe or the United States welds an identical box. And there's nothing there to put in it. The world's factories are on the other side of the planet. So that company has to ship a brand new empty box across the ocean to Asia just to fill it, eating a massive loss before the box has earned a cent. It's a circle that can't be broken. China didn't win only because labor was cheap. It won because in one place, it stacked the special steel, the automated assembly, and millions of tons of finished goods on top of each other, right at the water's edge. No other economy has that stack in one spot. And for years, that machine ran like clockwork. Until it didn't. And when it broke, the whole world felt it. 2020, the pandemic hit and the clockwork seized. In one part of the world, ports choked on too many containers. In another, factories sat idle because there was nothing to pack goods into. It became the biggest systemic jam in the history of global trade. It started when millions of people, stuck at home, went on an online shopping spree, ordering electronics and furniture by the truckload. A wave of cargo from China crashed into the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach. But under the health rules, dock workers and truck drivers didn't show up. Ships sat at anchor for weeks. On some days, more than 100 cargo ships were stuck in a line off the coast of California. And when the boxes finally came off the ships, there was nobody to haul them away. Empty containers piled up across America and Europe. Meanwhile, on the Chinese coast, factories ran flat out, but their warehouses were bursting, with nowhere to send anything. A viral rumor even spread that Beijing was secretly hoarding empty boxes to strangle Western industry. The reality was more boring and more brutal. It was just math. Sending a giant ship back to China empty, just to return used boxes, cost millions in fuel for a hold full of nothing. So it was cheaper and faster to just order brand new containers straight from the Chinese coast. And that's the moment the trap snapped shut. Only one place on Earth could build new containers in the numbers the world suddenly needed. Shipping a single box from Asia to the US West Coast, which had cost a few $1,000s, spiked toward $26,000 at the peak. The steel box had quietly become one of the most powerful tools of leverage on the planet. And whoever made the boxes decided who got served first. But here's what almost nobody watching that chaos understood. The West couldn't just switch its own factories back on to escape. It had already locked its own door. And the key was something as ordinary as paint. To break the monopoly, Western companies rushed to reopen container plants, and they slammed straight into a barrier they'd built themselves. Environmental law. Welding the metal box is the easy part. The real secret of this industry was always in the final step, the coating. For decades, factories sprayed containers with cheap, solvent-based paints that pumped huge volumes of toxic compounds into the air. So regulators in Europe and the United States cracked down hard. Running that kind of dirty coating line at home now means crushing fines. Western law quietly strangled its own heavy industry. And this is where the Chinese producers made a move that changed the game. Their own industry association forced the entire sector to abandon the old solvent paints and switch to water-based coatings on a hard deadline. Any factory that couldn't modernize in time was shut down. Here's why that was so hard. Think of ordinary watercolor paint. Brush it onto smooth metal and it beads up and runs off. And water barely evaporates from steel. To beat basic physics, the engineers had to rebuild their factories completely, adding giant robotic drying tunnels where computers control superheated air second by second. The big Chinese firms got state support and pulled it off in record time. The Western attempts cracked. Their experimental coatings peeled and fell apart after the first real storms at sea. So the Chinese makers ended up with a total monopoly on the clean assembly technology, and the West lost its last shot at a comeback. So how fragile is this really? In May of 2021, we got the answer. At the giant port of Yantian in Shenzhen, a single COVID outbreak, only around 150 cases, forced a partial shutdown for about 4 weeks. That local hiccup sent a shockwave around the entire planet. By some measures, the lost shipping capacity was worse than the 6 days the Ever Given spent wedged across the Suez Canal, an event that alone stranded hundreds of ships and cost the global economy billions. To be fair, the rest of the world is trying to escape. Investors have rushed to build assembly plants in India and Vietnam, and those efforts are real. But they keep hitting the same wall. These countries don't have their own mills to pour the Corten steel, so they import the alloy. And that makes the finished box cost far more than the Chinese original. You can't outcompete a rival by copying one factory when that rival has an entire coastline of steel, assembly, and cargo welded together. Closing that gap is not something you do with a single new plant and a press release. And there's a sharper edge to this now. In 2026, the US Justice Department unsealed an indictment accusing the 4 biggest Chinese makers of running a price-fixing cartel during the pandemic, even alleging they installed dozens of surveillance cameras on their own production lines to make sure no factory broke the agreed output caps. Whatever a court eventually decides, it tells you how much power sits inside that one steel box. Oil and microchips get all the attention, but the real lever might just be a plain metal crate. And right now, one country holds it. If you made it this far, you now understand the shipping container better than most of the people who write about global trade for a living. You know it was an American invention, that the West priced itself out of its own creation, and that the real monopoly isn't cheap labor, it's steel, geography, and paint, stacked in one place no one else can copy. If this reshaped how you see that boring metal box, hit like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell. Because the next one goes deep on another piece of the Chinese industrial machine you use every day without knowing it. Here's the tease. It moves faster than a plane on the ground, and the West still can't build it. So here's the real question, and I want you to pick a side in the comments. Can the United States and Europe ever claw back an industry like this? Or is that door permanently closed? Tell me which one and why.